He's a robust New Testament scholar and author of numerous popular level works, 6 New York Times bestsellers, and the one that really got him on the map that we were talking about just in the past hour was Misquoting Jesus. We have that book along with Jesus Interrupted for sale at the book table, and especially I think it's chapter 2 where you really go at it with the difficulties, and so I'm sure some of those will come forward here. And so this is something new that we've done here at Defenders, inviting someone who is not a Christian to share their analysis of what we take as sacred scripture. And so he's going to be sharing with us the concerns he has, and maybe he might light some fireworks with some of the things other speakers have said already. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bart Ehrman.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I actually really appreciate being invited because obviously my views are different from most of yours. I mean, the views of most of you. They're probably also different from most of yours individually, my views. But and so I appreciate that because I think it shows a kind of an openness to wanting to learn. And I have zero interest in converting or deconverting anybody. You are welcome. I hope we can all keep being thinking human beings, whatever our personal views happen to be. I was trying to think the last time I spoke at an apologetics conference, and I think it was probably 1976. So it's like, this is not my typical venue. All right. So the question I'm dealing with is: are the Gospels historically reliable? The problem of contradictions. Right. So I want to start out by giving some autobiography. A little bit about myself in terms of this question. I was raised in a Christian household. It wasn't an evangelical household, it was Episcopalian, but I had a fairly traditional view of the Bible growing up, that the Bible is inspired and that what it says is true. And that, I never had any reason to suspect that there was nothing false in the Bible growing up. And so I didn't grow up in a secular household or anything like that. It was a very Christian household. When I was in high school, I moved away from the Episcopal tradition and became a conservative evangelical. I had a born-again experience and committed my life to Christ as my Lord and Savior. And became quite fervent then in studying the Bible, which I had never done as an Episcopalian. Episcopalians typically don't study the Bible that much. But I got into Bible study, and I was being directed by somebody who had been a graduate of Moody Bible Institute, who believed that the Bible was inerrant, and so I just assumed that was the Christian view. And so I went to Moody Bible Institute, and that was, and I was completely committed to the idea that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God, without mistake, including, of course, no contradictions in the Gospels. When I went to graduate school at Princeton Theological Seminary, I had taken Greek in college, and then I took Hebrew, and so I was reading the Old Testament in Hebrew and the New Testament in Greek. And it's a very long story because it took a long time, but I started noticing that there were problems that were serious problems. I had known about problems at Moody, contradictions, and I could reconcile them or I could explain them away. And I finally got to a point where I just started noticing differences that I thought, yeah, I could explain that away, but the explanation is so complicated that it's like it doesn't make sense to explain it away. You could explain it away, but really, I mean, is this? So I got to a point where I just started thinking, what do I want to think about these? And I didn't. It took me a long time before I made any commitment to it. But what I really decided was that in what I was seeing as, how do I put this? I was seeing as difficulties that I didn't want to resolve these difficulties simply on the basis of what I believed. I actually wanted to use my head and figure it out. So there are two approaches to the Bible. You can assume, say the Gospels, you can simply assume that there are no contradictions. You can come to the task with it saying, look, the Bible's the Word of God. God gave us this Word. It cannot have mistakes in it. So there cannot be contradictions. That was my approach as an evangelical at Moody Bible Institute. And if you come at it with that assumption, you will not find mistakes because there can't be mistakes. So if there can't be mistakes, there aren't mistakes. Okay, so it's very simple. The other way is just to see if there are mistakes and then figure out what to do about it. Okay, you see, it's just two different approaches. And I finally decided, look, I'm just going to use my head, and I knew the arguments. Look, you're just a human. You know, how can you use human intelligence to criticize the Word of God? It's like it's you against God. You're a peon. What do you know? You don't know anything. And so I understood that, but I thought God had given me an intelligence. He'd given me a brain. And I thought, if I decide that there are problems, well, then there are problems, and I'll just need to deal with it then and figure out what I think. But I am going to use my intelligence. Not that I think I'm smarter than God. I was nothing like that. It may be that the people who taught me their mistakes, maybe they're the ones who are wrong. I'm not saying God is wrong. I'm saying maybe they were wrong. See what I mean? Okay, so I started finding things. I started finding, when I allowed that there could be actual contradictions, I started finding them. And wow, there are a lot more of these than I thought. What do I do about these? I ended up deciding that the Bible does have mistakes, that the Gospels do have contradictions in them. Some of these contradictions cannot plausibly be reconciled, and that it affects the historical reliability of the accounts, as I'll explain in a minute. My suggestion to you is that you have an open mind. Very simple. Just have an open mind. Be willing to change your views. If you're not willing to change your views, then you're not thinking. I'm not saying you have to change your views. Of course you don't have to change your views. You might think, well, you might look into it and decide, yep, I was right all along. Isn't that great? I'm always right. But you don't have to change it, but you really should genuinely be open to changing. Genuinely, not just saying you are, but really being genuinely open to change your view. That's my suggestion. So, the terms of the discussion, contradiction. What do I mean by contradiction? I mean two accounts, when you've got two or more accounts that are different from each other in ways that cannot be reconciled. I'm not talking about just differences. Yes, well, Matthew tells the story about the wise men, but Luke tells the stories about the shepherds, and so they're different. Well, yeah, they're different, but that's not a contradiction, right? A contradiction is when you've got two things that can't both be true at the same time. Okay, that's what I mean by a contradiction. And that's what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about different emphases or talking about different stories or reporting different sayings of Jesus or even different portrayals of Jesus. No, I'm talking about contradictions. Okay, two things that cannot be plausibly be reconciled. Historically reliable. What do I mean by historically reliable? If I read a newspaper article or something online, or I read a book that's describing something that happened in the past, and if in fact what it describes is not the way it happened in the past, then it's not historically reliable. If you read a description of something that happened in the past that is not how it happened, it's not reliable. If I tell you that yesterday I walked to Chicago from Chapel Hill, that is incorrect. That is not how you say, well, yeah, but you got here, so it's not really No, it's incorrect. I did not walk here. I flew here. So if it doesn't say it like it really was, it's not accurate. It might be accurate in other ways. Okay, so that's all I mean. So the relationship between the two. if you have two contradictory accounts of the same event, if they're actually contradictory, both accounts cannot be accurate. Two accounts, the same event, if they're contradictory, they both can't be accurate. One of them could be accurate, or the other could be accurate, or neither could be accurate. Those are the three options. But the option is not that they're both accurate. Okay? With me? Simple logic. Aristotelian logic, in fact. This has been around since the 4th century BCE. So, what everyone should happily concede, in my opinion, what everyone should happily concede, in theory, just about anything can be reconciled if you work hard enough at it. I walked to Chicago yesterday. Well, I was on the plane, and I walked up and down the aisle. So technically speaking, I did walk to Chicago. Okay, but that isn't how we talk, right? We don't talk that way. So in theory, you can reconcile anything in the Bible you want. There is nothing you cannot reconcile. When I was an evangelical, I reconciled everything. And so I understand that. So in theory, you can, but you're talking about plausibility as well, right? We're using our heads now. We're not just trying to be kind of straight literalists who are bound and determined to reconcile everything. Second, contradictions if you have contradictions, of course, there's a range of reasons you could have contradictions. Okay, so for example, you might have two sources of information. You've got some account of the Second World War, and one source says one thing that contradicts what another source, one book says one thing that contradicts what another book says. It could be because they've heard this from different sources of information, and one of the sources of information was just wrong. Okay, so it could be different sources of information. With the Gospels, it's like that. The Gospel authors had different sources of information. They heard different stories, they saw different things, they read different things, and they may have different, that might be why you'd get some contradictions. Or, for example, you might have an author who has a different point of view, and maybe they change something. Like they're reading something, they disagree with it, they change it, and so that would create a contradiction. So it's just because of a different point of view. You know, it's not a bad thing to have a different point of view, but it could create a contradiction. Or, as Mike has written his book, as you all know, about there could be we have ancient writing practices. Of course, in antiquity, they didn't write biographies like people do today. And so, of course, you have to understand how people in the ancient world wrote biographies. I completely agree with Mike on this, and we have to study ancient authors to see how they recounted both biographical and historical information. We have to read Plutarch and Suetonius and Tacitus. I mean, I spend my life reading these people. And so we absolutely have to do that. My point, though, is that even though there are reasons for contradictions to occur, that doesn't mean that they're not contradictions. They are still contradictions. You just know why they happened. Okay? So, and I'm perfectly on board with knowing why they happened. Perfectly on board. I think there's completely acceptable reasons for why these things happen, but I think they did happen. So, let me tell you some things that I will not concede. Unless you take me into the torture chamber, I am not going to concede any of this. I'm not going to concede that a contradiction is not a contradiction. If it's a contradiction, it's a contradiction. So I'm also going to not concede that if you've got two contradictory accounts, I'm not going to concede that they can both be accurate. They cannot both be accurate. I'm sorry. If they contradict each other, one of them is not accurate, or both of them are not accurate. It's just, okay, I'm not going to concede that one. And I'm not going to concede that we should stick to our guns no matter what. Whatever you've been brought up to think, whatever you've been taught, we should not stick to our guns because we just can't give it up. When it comes to anything involving the intellect, you can give it up. If logic, reason, truth takes you in a different direction. You should follow the truth. Don't necessarily follow what you've always thought. The other speakers and I are surely going to agree on all of this. So I'm not, but I want to emphasize it because it's going to get tricky here in a minute. So, let me urge you two things. One is to see for yourself and not accept somebody else's view. See, you've got to make your decision. Just because you know a smart person who thinks something doesn't mean you have to think it too. Use your head. Figure it out. And when it comes to the Gospels, what I suggest is that you do a horizontal reading. So people read the Gospels in a variety of ways. Most people, of course, don't read the Gospels, but those who do read the Gospels, several ways. Some of my students, I teach in Chapel Hill. It's in the Bible Belt, and what a lot of my students do when they read the Gospels is what I call the Ouija board approach, which is it's like a fortune-telling thing where you kind of open it up and you stick your finger down on a verse, and that's like your verse for the day, and so that you read it like that. Okay, that's fine. You can read the Bible that way if you want to, but you're not really going to understand the Bible if you read it that way. So another way, the way most people read it, the Bible, is they'll read it like a little bit at a time. Like they'll read a passage here or a passage there, and I think probably most people kind of do it like that. But if you really want to know what the Gospel of Mark is saying, it's not that helpful to read a passage from Mark and a passage from Paul and a passage from John, because you are reading things that are on the Bible, but if you want to know what Mark has to say about something, it's better to read Mark and see what Mark has to say, because it might be different in some ways. I'm not saying contradictory, but it might be a different emphasis than some other book. And so if you want to see what Mark is emphasizing, you read Mark. So when people want to do that, they typically do a vertical reading, which is the way we read books. You start at the top of the page, and you go to the bottom of the page. Then you go to the next page. You go from the top to the bottom. It's vertical. Top to bottom, you go from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. And that's how you read books. Yes. Okay. So should definitely read the Bible that way. Should definitely read the Gospels that way. It's the way to read. That's how we read. But there's another way to read that most of us don't read, which is what I call a horizontal reading, and this has its own value. It's not the only way. It's not the best way to read the Bible. It's one way to read the Bible, and if you want to see contradictions, this is the way to read the Bible. You read a passage in one of the Gospels and put it next to a passage in another Gospel and next to a passage in the other Gospel, and read across the accounts horizontally. Read this one, then this one, then this one, and compare them. And see if they line up. You don't need an expert to guide you in this. Just do it. Read them horizontally and decide, is this consistent or not? Simple. Hardly anybody does it. So that's what I urge you to do. Nothing to be afraid of, just do it. Let me give you a very simple example to begin with of what happens when you do a horizontal reading. In the Gospel of Mark and in the Gospel of Matthew, you have an account of this synagogue leader named Jairus, who comes up to Jesus in order to help him out in a personal situation. I put Mark here first because most scholars could see that Mark was the first gospel to be written. For this, it doesn't matter to me whether you agree with it. It will not matter to the example at all. But most people think Mark was the first, and that Matthew had Mark as one of his sources. So whether you think that or not, it doesn't really matter for this. But that's why I put Mark first. In Mark's account, Jairus comes up to Jesus and he says, "My daughter is very sick. Could you come heal her?" So I'm putting these verses here so you can write these down, look it up yourself, read it horizontally. "My daughter's sick. Could you come and heal her?" And Jesus tells him not to fear. And so he starts to go. But before he can get to Jairus' house, a woman comes up who's been bleeding for 12 years. She's had a hemorrhage, and she touches his cloak so she can be healed. And she's healed. And he feels the power go out, and he talks with her, and it delays him. And while he's dealing with this woman, somebody comes from Jairus' house and says, "It's too late. She died." And Jesus says, Don't fear. Jesus goes and he raises her from the dead. Beautiful story in Mark chapter 5. Matthew has the same story. In Matthew's account, Jairus comes to Jesus and he says, "My daughter has died. Can you raise her from the dead?" The daughter is dead when Jairus comes. In Mark, the girl was not dead when Jairus came. I'm calling this a simple example because, like, you might think, who cares? Right? The point is he raised the girl from the dead, right? Yeah, okay, that is the point. That's the point. But here, the point I'm making is, how did it actually happen? If Mark is right that she wasn't dead yet, then Matthew cannot be right that she was dead. Now, you can think of lots of reasons for Matthew. I assume Matthew had Mark in it, that he changed it for some reason. Or you could say the other way around. Maybe Matthew was first and Mark changed it. Somebody changed the story, and you can think of reasons for why somebody would change the story. Maybe Matthew wanted a shorter story. Maybe Matthew thought it'd be more dramatic. Maybe there are all sorts of, and this is the kind of thing that ancient historians did all the time. They changed their sources. But my point is, they both can't be historically accurate. Okay? Now, this is not going to lead you to lose your faith, whether she was dead or not, right? This is not, but my point is that if there's a contradiction in a small thing, if one of these accounts is wrong in a small thing, how do you know they're not wrong in bigger things? Okay, let me give you some other kinds of examples that are a little more substantive. You'll be glad to know. So I'm just picking. Look, I've got a few examples, and you can have. We could spend months talking about the examples. I'm going to give you a couple. A couple of these are famous. People have explanations for these things. Of course, everybody's got an explanation for something. But here's a question. Both Matthew and Luke have a genealogy of Jesus. Okay? They both recount who's his father, grandfather, great-grandfather. They do a genealogy. They're different in lots of ways. These genealogies are very different in lots of ways, really interesting ways that I'm not going to go into. A lot of the differences are not necessarily contradictions. But here's a question. In these genealogies, who is Joseph's father, grandfather, and great-grandfather? Okay, simple question. Read them horizontally and see. So, Matthew chapter 1, verses 2 through 16. Joseph's father is somebody named Jacob. His grandfather is somebody named Nathan. His great-grandfather is named Eleazar. His great-great-grandfather is Elias, and it goes all the way back, Matthew's genealogy goes all the way back to Abraham, the father of the Jews. Okay? So, just read the text. That's what it says. Luke's genealogy. Chapter 3. Joseph's father is somebody named Heli. His grandfather is Mathat. That looks like Mathan, but it's a different word. Mathat. Great-grandfather is somebody named Levi. Great-great-grandfather is somebody named Melchi. The genealogies are different all the way from Joseph to David. Now, there are lots of explanations for this that people have had over the years. When I was committed to there being no mistakes in the New Testament, Rob had said earlier that Matthew's account seems to be Joseph's account, and Luke's account seems to be Mary's account. And so one of the ways people reconcile this is by saying that that one is the genealogy of Joseph, and the other is the of Joseph, and the other is the genealogy of Mary. Okay, so then that's why they're different. Because one's Mary, one's Joseph. Okay, two parents, two genealogies, which makes sense until you read the text. The text says it's Joseph's genealogy in both of them. This is Joseph's genealogy. Well, maybe Joseph had a stepfather, and the stepfather was named, and he had a real father's name, and so you trace it back like that. So you come up with these explanations. And if you start digging deep into the text, none of them works. They have two different genealogies because, in my opinion, I am certain they contradict each other. My opinion about why there's a contradiction is because I think they have two different sources of information. Contrary to what people say, ancient Jews did not keep their genealogies. People tell you this all the time. It's absolutely not true. Jews did not. So some Jew living in the year, 29 AD, he didn't know who his great-great-grandfather was any more than you do. They didn't do that. But people think because they read in the Bible, you got all these genealogies, that this is what Jews are doing the whole time. No, they absolutely did not do that. So they had sources of information. They wanted to trace Jesus' line back to David because he's the son of David. Well, what if you don't know who his great-great-great-great-grandfather is? Well, you got to make something up. And so they came up with something. Whether you agree with that explanation or not, it's a contradiction. Okay, here's an interesting one. Did Joseph, Mary, and Jesus flee to Egypt after Jesus' birth, or did they return to Nazareth? This one is trickier. All right, so here's what happens in Matthew. Again, just read it yourself carefully. You've got to read these things carefully. You can't just breeze over them. You got to read them word for word and think about what you're reading. Here's what happens. I'm going to summarize it for you. Just look it up and you'll see. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Chapter 1 of Matthew. The wise men come following a star to worship him. Chapter 2. They come to Jerusalem, and Herod makes inquiries. Herod learns that these wise men are trying to come to worship the King of the Jews. Okay, so Herod finds out that the King of the Jews has been born, and this is not good news for Herod because he's the King of the Jews. And so if there's some other King of the Jews born, like his position's in trouble here. And so Herod learns about the birth of the King of the Jews. He sends out troops in order to kill the child because he wants to get rid of the competition. So he sends the troops to Bethlehem, and they kill all the baby boys up to 2 years old. But Joseph learns in a dream that this is going to be happening, and so he takes the family and they flee to Egypt. Now the distance from Bethlehem to, say, Cairo is about 250 miles. Okay, I've just put that on here so you realize that they're walking, right? They're not flying. They are walking to Chicago. They're walking to Cairo, and so what do you do? 20 miles a day? I don't know what you do, but I mean, it's like, so it takes a while to get there. And they actually stay in Egypt until Herod dies. So we don't know how long that is. Whether we're talking about, I assume it's more than a couple of days, because otherwise, they would just go hide out for a couple of days. But it's like, they're down there for a while. And then when they find out that Herod dies, they come back, and they don't settle back in Bethlehem because Herod's son, Archelaus, is the king now, and Archelaus is worse than his dad was, and so we can't settle here. We've got to go up north. And so they go up north to Galilee. They go way up north into Galilee, which is another 4 or 5 day journey on foot. Okay, and then they settle in Nazareth. Okay, fine. That's the story in Matthew. Familiar story. Luke also is a familiar story, but it's very different. In Luke, Joseph and Mary, and the way the work happens in Luke is Joseph and Mary are from Nazareth, and they travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem to register because there's a worldwide census. Caesar Augustus is the emperor. There's a worldwide census. Everybody has to register for this tax. And so Joseph actually is from the line of King David, and so David is from Bethlehem, and so he goes to Bethlehem and to register for this tax. And Mary happens to be pregnant at the time, and so they go there, and she goes into labor there in Bethlehem, and Jesus is born then in Bethlehem, and the shepherds come and they worship him that night. On the 8th day, Bethlehem is very close to Jerusalem. If you've ever been there, you just walk to Jerusalem if you've got an afternoon. So the 8th day, he's circumcised, which the law demands that a Jewish boy has to be circumcised on the 8th day. Then Joseph and Mary perform the rites of purification in the temple according to the law. So this is referring to something that's in Leviticus chapter 12. A woman. So in the Old Testament, when a woman gives birth, she's ceremonially impure. It doesn't mean she's sinful or anything like that, but it's just, there are certain things that make you ritually impure. Like if you touch a corpse, you've got to be purified of it. If a woman has her period, she has to be purified of it. If a man has an emission of semen, he has to be purified. They're just these kind of rules that you've got to be purified for these things. And the rule for purification for giving birth is in Leviticus 12. It happens 33 days after the circumcision. So she goes to the temple and she performs a sacrifice, and then she's purified, and then that's fine. It just means she can now go to the temple and she can worship, and so she's had the ritual purification. So that happens 33 days. So that's so the 8th day. So this is 41 days after Jesus' birth. And then we're told that when they finish, they return to Nazareth. Verse 39. Okay, good. The problem is, according to Matthew, they don't do that. According to Matthew, they go to Egypt, 250 miles away, and they stay in Egypt, and they wait till Herod, and then they come back. So if Matthew's right that they fled to Egypt, how can Luke be right if they went back to Nazareth 41 days later? Okay, well, you can work hard, you can reconcile it, you can reconcile anything you want, but the reality is these two seem to be at odds with each other. Okay, let me take a couple from the end of the gospel. So from the end of the Gospels. Here's one that's kind of interesting that you can easily come up with an explanation for, but it's a contradiction. So Jesus is crucified, and in Mark's Gospel, you have this amazing scene where Jesus dies, and his last words are, my God, why have you forsaken me? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And he dies. And it's like, I think he's genuinely asking, where are you? He dies, and the curtain in the temple rips in half is the next thing that happens. The centurion says, truly this man was the Son of God. It is one of the most amazing scenes in the Gospel of Mark, because on one hand, it seems like Jesus is in doubt, but whether you think so or not, it's not that important, but the reader's not in doubt. The curtain in the temple was the curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. God dwelt in the Holy of Holies, and nobody could go into the Holy of Holies except one man, the high priest, once a year on the Day of Atonement, could go in the presence of God to offer a sacrifice for the sins of the people. But normal people had no access to God where he dwelt. Jesus dies, and the curtain is ripped in half. Now, everyone has access through the death of Jesus. It's a terrific, terrific passage, because it's the death of Jesus that gives people access to God for Mark's gospel. So that's in Mark. Luke has the crucifixion, of course. Jesus is crucified, and he has the ripping of the curtain in the temple. But Luke is explicit that the curtain rips in half before Jesus dies. Read it yourself. Now, of course you can reconcile, well, there are actually two curtains. Or first time I ripped halfway, the other time the other half. But in fact, it says it ripped from top to bottom in Mark, so it couldn't be twice. So, unless it ripped in a different part, I don't know. It's different. You say, well, who cares? Well, I think Luke cared, because Luke is trying to say something different from what Mark was saying. And it would take probably 20 minutes to explain what Luke is trying to do with this, but the point is he's changed it. Luke had Mark, just as Matthew had Mark as one of us, so did Luke. Luke also changed some things, and there are reasons for why he changed it. Yes, there are reasons, but it creates a contradiction, which means they both are not historically accurate, because it's one or the other, or neither. Okay, let me give you another example. Did the disciples see the resurrected Jesus in Galilee, or did they stay in Jerusalem? This relates to one of the issues that Rob was talking about earlier, but it's not the same issue. It's a different issue. In both Matthew and Luke, Jesus is raised from the dead, and he appears to his disciples. Okay? In Matthew and Luke and in John. It doesn't happen in Mark, actually. Mark's gospel looks like it ends with them finding the empty tomb. But it doesn't matter for my purposes here. My purposes here are comparing Matthew and Luke. And I think there's a contradiction here that cannot be solved. Where did the disciples see the resurrected Jesus in Matthew? It's very simple in Matthew. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene and tells her to go tell the disciples to go to Galilee and meet him there. Galilee, so if you go from, say this is taking place in Jerusalem, so from Jerusalem to Capernaum is about 80 miles. Okay, so say about a 4-day walk. Okay? All right, so tells Mary, go tell the disciples, go to Galilee. And they go. And they see Jesus there. And he gives them the Great Commission. And then that's it. Right? So Jesus meets the disciples in Galilee, and that's the only place he meets the disciples. Matthew. Okay, so just make note of it. And then think about Luke for a second. Where did the disciples see the resurrected Jesus in Luke 24? This is a little more complicated story. It's a longer story. The women go to the tomb, and they learn from the two men there that Jesus has been raised from the dead. Okay, he's been raised. And they go to tell the disciples. And the disciples don't believe them. Those crazy women, they're always dreaming up stuff. Disciples don't believe the women. That same day, literally it says, that same day, so this is the day Jesus was raised from the dead, or it's the third day after his death. The same day that they discover the tomb, the same day, Jesus appears to two followers on the road to Emmaus. The famous story of the road to Emmaus happens the same day. The two, at that same hour, we're told literally, the same hour of that day, the two go and tell the disciples that they've seen Jesus alive. So this is the day of his resurrection. Okay? Same day, same hour. While they're talking about it, Jesus appears to them. Okay, this is in Jerusalem. Jesus appears to them. And Jesus tells them to stay in Jerusalem, do not leave. Do not leave Jerusalem. They do so, and they're still in Jerusalem at the end of the gospel, the very last verse of the gospel. They are still in Jerusalem. In the book of Acts, written by the same author, Luke, the disciples are still with Jesus for 40 days in Jerusalem. He appears to them for 40 days, proving to them that he's been raised from the dead, and then he ascends to heaven right outside of Jerusalem. He ascends to heaven. They remain in Jerusalem until later, chapters later, they get driven out of Jerusalem by the persecution that arises. Okay. In Matthew's gospel, they leave Jerusalem right away to go to Galilee. That's where they meet Jesus. And in Luke, they do not leave Jerusalem ever until long after his ascension. So which is it? You can't say, well, they stayed in Jerusalem, then they left for a few days and came back. No, they're told to stay, and they stay. Or do they go to Galilee? There are very good reasons for this contradiction. You can think of, there are good reasons for it. I mean, there were reasons that Matthew wanted to say one thing and Luke wanted to say another thing. But my point is, they say opposite things. So they both cannot be historically reliable. Okay? You can do this 100 times in the Gospels. And at a point, you just start saying, maybe there are some differences that can't be reconciled. And if you can't reconcile the differences, they can't be all historically reliable. And maybe that doesn't matter to you, which is fine. I mean, if it doesn't matter to you, it's fine. But you shouldn't say then that every word in here is accurate, because it's not. There are other kinds of contradictions besides contradictions between Gospels. For example, there are contradictions with known facts of history. It will be much harder to convince you of this, and so I'm not basing my argument on this, and so if you don't buy this, it's fine. You still got to read the Gospels horizontally. But there are known facts of history that in fact, the Gospels contradict. Take, for example, this census. So according to Luke chapter 2, I mentioned it earlier, Caesar Augustus is the Roman emperor, and we're told that under Caesar Augustus, there was a census, and the entire world had to register for the census. Well, that's obviously not true. I mean, people in China are not going to register for some census that's taking place in the Roman Empire. So okay, but just say he means the entire Roman Empire. There was no worldwide census under Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus's reign is really well documented. There was never a census throughout the Roman Empire that everybody had to follow, let alone a census where everybody registered for the census by going to their ancestral home. Joseph goes to Bethlehem because David is his ancestor, and David came from Bethlehem. This is so problematic. David lived 1,000 years earlier. You mean people are going where their ancestors lived 1,000 years ago? So, all right, suppose the Democrats take over the Senate as well as Congress at the next election, and they take the presidency, and they dump a bunch more taxes on us. And so they think, okay, we need some mechanism to make people pay tax. Okay, everybody has to go to where their ancestors came from 1,000 years ago to register for this tax. Where are you going to go? 1,000 years ago? And you say, well, okay, but maybe Joseph grew up in Bethlehem, so no, that's not what it says. It says the reason he goes to Bethlehem is because he comes from the house of David. So he's registering where his ancestor came from. Well, okay, where did David's ancestor come from 1,000 years before that? Did the Romans say, okay, figure out 1,000 years ago and then go there? Really? So apart from that, there was no census of any kind throughout the Roman Empire under Caesar Augustus, period. All right, so there are contradictions in known facts of history, and there are issues of just kind of general historical plausibility in the Gospels. A famous example is Matthew 27, when Jesus is crucified, and the graves are opened up, and these people rise from the dead, and they start walking around in Jerusalem, which is often seen as one of the weirder passages in the New Testament, and kind of hard to figure out. And really? I mean, these are like zombie figures or something. Presumably they die again. And it's like, what? I mean, so much, of course. I mean, there are a lot of even evangelicals who will say that, okay, that's like, it's not really literal. Okay, I am so pleased with that. I'm happy with that. It's fine. It's not literal. If you don't think that's literal, why do you think other passages are literal? Well, that one defies probability. Okay, how about walking on the water? Does that defy probability? No, you can do that. You can do that? Let me see you do that. Well, Jesus could do that. Yeah, of course, because God empowered him. But God could empower these people to rise from the dead and walk around Jerusalem. Right? So if you're going to say this one didn't happen, why do you say that one did happen? On what grounds do you say that? It's easier just to say that the Gospels are filled with information, some of which is historically accurate. Of course, a lot of it's historically accurate. And it has information that's not historically accurate. Sometimes seen in contradictions when you read horizontally, sometimes seen by contradicting facts we know from history otherwise, and sometimes just going against our broad common sense. We're all urging you, be thinking people and use your brains. Do you really want to think this? And if the evidence is against you, why do you want to think it? All right, let me conclude with residual questions. I sometimes am told that since I'm a non-believer, I am required to find contradictions in the Bible. That is absolutely not true. The Bible could be inerrant. I would still be a non-believer. I'm a non-believer for none of these reasons. This has nothing to do with why I don't believe. Contradiction, nothing to do with why I don't believe. It's a completely different story, why I'm not a Christian. And I think there are inerrant books in the world. I think there are books that don't have mistakes in them. Of course there are. Probably, we used to get phone books. I mean, theoretically, they could be without mistakes. Doesn't mean God inspired them. It just doesn't mean they have any mistakes in them. Well, how do you figure if it does have a mistake? You find out if there's a mistake. It's like that with the Bible. You find out if there's a mistake. So you don't have to say there are contradictions if you're not a believer. To see these contradictions, you have to reject miracles or have an anti-supernaturalist bias. If I had a nickel for every time somebody told me that the reason I have these views is because I have an anti-supernaturalist bias, I would buy a beach condo in the Bahamas. I mean, it's got nothing to do with whether miracles happen or not. Whether you believe in miracles or not, it doesn't matter. I believed in the contradictions of the Bible when I was a Christian. A committed Christian. So it's got nothing to do with naturalist or supernaturalist biases. Does seeing these contradictions mean you have to reject your faith? No. You might have to shift your faith, you might have to change things, but if you're an intelligent person, of course you're going to change your mind about things. Otherwise, you're not an intelligent person. Sorry. But you have to be willing to change your mind, and it does not mean you give up on your Christianity. It means you have a more sophisticated Christianity. It's much better to be an intelligent believer than an ignorant believer. It's better. And in this case, you need to figure out what you think about these. It doesn't mean rejecting your faith. Can two accounts both be historically reliable if they're contradictory? No. They both might be meaningful. They both might explain what this author is trying to achieve. They might show that this author is following ancient ways of writing history and biography. They might show all sorts of things, but they can't both be right, historically. Is there anything to fear from the truth? So here's back to my personal story. When I started seeing these things, I started freaking out. How can there be mistakes in the Gospels? This is the Word of God. And I was comforted by the idea that St. Augustine propounded, to paraphrase, that if there's anything that's true, it comes from God. God is the God of truth, which means all truth is God's truth. If something's true, it's from God. If it's true that there are contradictions in the Gospels, then that's true, and that means it comes from God. That was my thinking at the time, and I'm no longer a believer, but I still think that that's the right attitude. You don't have to be afraid of the truth simply because it's going to make you change your mind about something, even if that something is near and dear to you. You should follow the truth no matter what. Thank you very much.
All right, I had to put my sunglasses on for that. All right.
I hope it didn't blind you to the truth.
Oh, that's better. Okay. All right, so we've got a number of questions coming in. The first one, some people were curious. You just referenced here that you have other reasons for rejecting the Christian worldview. Not to give us a 20-minute spiel on it, but roughly what are those reasons?
Yeah. So when I realized that there were difficulties in the Gospels and throughout the Bible, that there were contradictions and historical mistakes, I continued to be a Christian for many years. people have sometimes said that I became, said about me without even asking me, that I became an atheist once I realized there were problems with the Bible. It's just like so wrong. It's like had nothing to do with it. I was a practicing Christian for many years, very active in my church for many years after realizing these problems with the Bible. I left the faith for unrelated reasons. The reason has to do with the problem of suffering in the world and how you explain that there's so much pain and misery in the world if there's one God and he's ultimately in charge. If you believe in the sovereignty of God, that God answers prayer, that he intervenes on the behalf of people that he loves, why doesn't it happen? Now, I know over lunch I'm going to hear 29 explanations, and people, I know the explanations, and you've heard most of them too, and some of them are satisfying to many people. Some of them are satisfying to me, but I don't believe it. I left the faith because I just don't, I simply don't think that if God answers my prayer that I got that job or that I got that parking space, whatever I prayed for, I got, and 7 children have starved to death in the world since I started answering this question, why did God answer my prayer but not theirs? And of course, believers will say, oh, it's because of this, this, and this, and that. I don't believe it. That's why.
All right, we've got a question from Texter 2872, which is going to be related, I think, to some things that may get brought up at the panel discussion. This person asks, could one gospel report events in chronological form and another gospel report the same events, but add other events that happened to the timeline that were omitted by the first, or see the same event from a different perspective that would appear to make it a contradiction?
Yes.
Well, all right, so...
It happens all the time, yeah. But those aren't something that appears to be a contradiction that's not a contradiction is not a contradiction. So I'm only talking about things that really are contradictions.
Okay, all right, let's see.
So
here.
if somebody wants to propose a particular instance of this, we look at it and see whether it works or not. For example, if you could say, Matthew's saying that they go to Galilee after the resurrection, Luke's saying they stay in Jerusalem, and maybe Matthew's reporting something that didn't get into Luke, and so it did both, and so that's the reason. And I say, no, Luke is explicit, they didn't leave. It's not that he's leaving some information out to allow for a time period where they could have left. He says they didn't leave. And that's a difference. So that's a contradiction. So, but the kind of thing you're describing, yes, absolutely. Jairus is, if Jairus comes and says, my daughter's sick, come, and then this hemorrhaging woman comes and he gets delayed, and so he gets there later, or another story tells it without the hemorrhaging woman, that's not a contradiction. It just that somebody put something in and it changes the story, but it's not a contradiction. The contradiction is, did the girl die before or after Jesus came? See, that's a contradiction, and the interposition of the hemorrhaging woman has no bearing on it.
So let me ask you a sort of a follow-up on here. Mike used an example last night of the cursing of the fig tree.
Yeah.
It occurs seemingly at different times or between different events. Would that be a contradiction to you, or that wouldn't qualify because it's...
No. I think I don't see that as kind of a big contradiction. I think I'll say, this isn't about Mike's example there, but I will say that whenever I've had, not with Mike, I've debated Mike several times, as you know, whenever other times when I've had debates with New Testament scholars about the contradiction thing, one thing they invariably have done is they've gone through a bunch of alleged contradictions and then showed that they are not contradictions. But the alleged contradictions are almost always things that nobody says is a contradiction. So what it looks like, they've won all these arguments, but I don't know who they're arguing with. And so, okay, I'll name a name. Why not? All right. So I had this debate with Pete Williams. You all know Peter Williams. So he's been a friend of mine for years. He's a really good scholar, textual critic. He's a Syriac specialist. I really respect his work in textual criticism. He's smart. He's interesting. We have this debate. He wrote this book, Can We Trust the Gospels? And he has a chapter on contradictions. And he lists something like 7 contradictions and then explains why they're not contradictions. And in the debate, I said, well, Peter, I don't understand. What you're saying are the contradictions are not things that anybody points out as a contradiction. So yes, you can answer those, but why not answer the ones that people say are contradictions? See, because it looks like you won the argument, but you're just knocking down a straw man, right? And so we'll debate about this.
We've had a couple questions come in. I'm going to rephrase them to sort of synthesize them. So, over your experience, you sort of discovered these contradictions. Has there been anything in the reverse order? Has there been something where you've seemed to have encountered a contradiction and you thought, oh, you know what, actually that's not?
Yeah, no, it happens a lot, but I'm not sure I can think of a specific example, but it absolutely has happened, yeah. Hold on. No, I can't think of one. But the reason I'm remembering this is because when I was going into this debate with Pete, I was with a friend of mine named Jeff Syker, who's a good friend of mine, New Testament scholar, taught New Testament for 30 years out in California. And it's time to be doing this debate about actually the Gospels. And he said, oh yeah, and he started naming these things. And he came up with 3 or 4, and I said, yeah, I used to think that. I said, yeah, I don't think that's a contradiction, though. I explained why it's not a contradiction. So I'm just trying to find what are the contradictions. I have no commitment to any particular thing. So yeah.
One person, 7713, is wondering, what led you to your original born again experience?
I got active in high school in a Campus Life Youth for Christ group, which is, you all know Young Life. I don't know if you know Campus Life, but it's comparable. And the fellow who was in charge of that was a very dynamic person who had graduated. He's probably in his mid-20s, who had graduated from Moody Bible Institute a few years earlier. And he convinced me that even though I went to church every week and said the prayers and confessed the creed,